Okay, welcome everyone. Today we are going to cover the first part of chapter 8 in our textbook, which is I believe it's called Crisis and Constitution. Crisis and Constitution. So if you remember, last week we learned, or earlier this week, we learned about the American Revolution. Okay, from 1776 to 1783. The United States was involved in the American Revolution. That is a 7-year war. And really, technically, the war got started in 1775. So we're talking 8 years of warfare. Okay? 8 years of war, and the United States are now fully independent. But like we talked about yesterday, what comes next? What do we do next? And how do we move on as a republic? Okay? You understand that after the initial Declaration of Independence, the 13 colonies worked together, but they did not see themselves as one big country the same way that we do now. Okay? In many ways, the Declaration of Independence referred not explicitly to the United States, but these United States. Okay? Not one country, but 13 countries. Bounded together by a firm league of friendship. That's the idea. So, why did they do this? A lot of times in modern historians like to really dog on the early republic for some of the mistakes they made as the 13 colonies before the Constitution. And I think that that's really unfair to them, okay? So much of what the colonies had fought for in the Revolution was the idea of small republican governments, okay? There was a belief among the founding fathers that a large country could not safely secure liberty, but that the best and most noble governments are small and simple governments that do not infringe upon people's liberties. Basically, the more that a country grows, the more likely it is that the government will become corrupt, okay? All right, when a government is small, it is able to keep people, right next to the government. The people who lead the government, they are citizens, they're affected by the actions of the government. There's not as much ability for someone to concentrate power in one hand, okay? All right, I can tell you from experience as a member of a city council, okay? It's a small government in a small town. If you do something that people don't like, they'll tell you, okay? If you do something that they do like, you'll hear about it. And you're very responsive to the needs of the people. But whenever you have one person who's in charge of millions of people, how does that one leader relate to all the millions of commoners in his country? How does that one person do what is best for everyone when the country is so big? So the early founding fathers wanted the government to be small, and they wanted literally the republics to be small. If you look at the history of democracy, most of the republics that have existed in history before the United States were very small city-states, like Athens in Greece, or the republics of like Venice, okay? Right? And there's some Italian republics. I think Venice is a republic anyways, but there's some small republics in like Italy and Greece throughout history. But there's not a whole lot of big republics, okay? There is a fear among the founding fathers that you cannot let the governments get too big or they'll run wild with power. And they're particularly afraid of executive power, okay? In a government, the executive function of government is the part of government that does stuff, okay? They go forth and they make the laws a reality, okay? The legislature, they make the laws, but the executive enforces the laws. That's just typically in government, okay? Now, executives tend to be kings in Europe, okay? The executive power of kings was very, very strong in different parts of the world. In particular, France and Spain were known for having very powerful, like absolute monarchies. England, for what it's worth, had one of the weakest monarchies in Europe. But even that was too dangerous for the Americans. Okay? You notice that during the early days of colonization, there were a few people in the early colonies, like the founders of Maryland, the founder of Georgia, and a few other different colonies that were founded, like Pennsylvania, where the founders wanted to be in total control of their particular colony. And they wanted like hereditary titles in some cases. And in all those cases, the colonies resisted those powerful families like the Calverts and the Oglethorpes and William Penn, okay? They resisted that idea of creating a powerful hereditary executive. And in none of the colonies did this happen. Also, during the lead up to the American Revolution, the villains for most Americans were the royal governors. Those people that were put in America by the King of England. They reported directly to the King of England, and they told the people of the colonies what to do. They dissolved the legislatures. They did all sorts of stuff that the colonies didn't like. So when the colonies have a chance to be independent, they make their governments much different than the old royal governments, okay? This is like, you know, whenever a kid grows up and they move out of town and they do everything they can to not be like their mom or dad. You dress different, you act different, you do everything you can. You go to different places, you try to be the exact opposite of your parents. But then slowly over time, you start to transform into them. Watch out, young ladies and young men. One day you'll find yourself looking in a mirror and you'll see your mom or you'll see your dad. And you'll be like, what have I become? And just, well.
Which one are you, mom or dad?
Ooh, that's a good question. I'll let y'all figure that one out. Anyways, moving on though, what happens with the Americans is that they throw off the king and they try to be as different from England as they possibly can. So the early state constitutions do a lot to curb the powers of the governor and strengthen the powers of their legislatures. And they all come up with written constitutions that limit the power of the government, okay? And here's the thing. A constitution is not something that just exists everywhere, okay? It's kind of a newish thing. It's not brand new, but the idea of having a constitution, a written plan for your government, is something that is not universal, okay? In France or in Spain, the Constitution is whatever the King of France says it is, okay? He can wake up tomorrow and say, everyone in the kingdom has to wear red. And everyone in the kingdom's got to wear red, you know what I mean? Unless he does something too crazy and then people fight against him, they chop off his head. Spoiler alert, they do, okay? But theoretically, in absolute monarchies, there is no constitution, there is no limits on the government of the people. But in a constitution, the government is limited. There are some things that the government just can't do. Typically, these things that the government cannot do are what we call your rights, the things the government cannot take away from you. Okay, when you talk about the fact that you have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, those are rights that the government cannot take away from you without due process of law. So that limits their government powers. So anyways, each of the states have their own government. They each have their own way of doing things, and each one is a little different, but they typically are fairly close to each other. Now, Congress, on the other hand, is much different. The 13 states gathered together in the Second Continental Congress, and they go from just a Congress. Remember, they started out as just complaining about taxes. And then by the time it's over, they've started a new country. And that Congress ushers in a plan of government called the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation is our first constitution as a country. The Articles of Confederation did not work, but they weren't worthless, okay? Some people like to dog on them and say that they're just absolutely terrible and awful and poorly done and everything. But here's the thing. We threw this together while we're in the middle of the American Revolution, okay? We had other things going on, okay? So we put together the Articles of Confederation, and it is a satisfactory plan of government for us until we come up with the American Constitution, Now, there's a lot of problems with the Articles, but right now let's talk about the positives. Number one, the Articles of Confederation does preserve the state's independence. The federal government is virtually non-existent, and the states each basically have full and total authority over most of the things that they do, with a few exceptions, okay? The Articles of Confederation has no national executive and has no national courts. It only has a national legislature. Each of the 13 states get one vote in the legislature, okay? If you want to change the Articles of Confederation, all 13 states have to agree. That means that Rhode Island could say, I don't like this. And that could hang up all the other 12, okay?
Does the people vote within to decide what their state wanted or what their
So they would elect representatives. So each state got to figure out how they wanted to choose their own representatives. So the state governments, all the state governments are representative governments. The people within the states vote for the state governments, and then the state governments select their legislatures, okay? So it's a little bit different than we do things now. But typically, the white men that owned property in the different states, they were typically the ones that were able to vote. You typically had to be 21, a man, white, you had to own property, okay? So that meant that, you know, day laborers in the city of Boston wouldn't be eligible to vote. Someone who has like a farm, they'd be able to vote. Or someone who owns a business, they'd be able to vote, okay? But they would vote for their representatives in the state legislature. So the people of Massachusetts would vote for the state government of Massachusetts, and then they would select a representative to go to Congress to represent Massachusetts, okay? Essentially, what the Articles of Confederation does is it sets up 13 independent countries that are bound together by, let's see, Article 3 of the Articles of Confederation says, the said states hereby severally enter into a firm league of friendship with each other for their common defense, the security of their liberties, and their mutual and general welfare, binding themselves to assist each other against all force offered to or attacks made upon them or any of them on account of religion, sovereignty, trade, or any other pretense, whatever. Okay? So, what this does is it says, me and Nathan, we are independent people, okay? We are different. My business is my business, his business is his business. But if anyone else tries to mess with us, we team up, okay? We have, you mind if I shake your hand, or yeah, I'll wash my hands real quick. Just for the demonstration, okay? Okay. Okay, for a firm league of friendship. A firm league of friendship. It's firm. Not firm enough. Firm it up. There you go. Firm. A firm league of friendship. All right? Now, that firm league of friendship that we have defends each other. Okay? If someone messes with North Carolina, they're getting all 12 other colonies against them, or states against them. But North Carolina is in charge of its own business. Okay? It does its own thing. No one else tells it what to do. Okay? The other states really can't mess with what goes on in North Carolina. But what happens between the 13 states and the rest of the world, the Congress gets to kind of regulate. So Rhode Island can't make an alliance with France while South Carolina makes an alliance with Spain. Okay? Though they are prohibited from doing that. So the 13 independent countries, they are united together in their foreign policy. Does that make sense? Their interactions with the rest of the world, they're united. But as far as what happens within the borders of their own states, they can do whatever they want within reason. Anyways, so there's very little power that the Articles of Confederation gives to the federal government. And that's because we were just dealing with a very powerful executive government in England, and we didn't want no part of it. So we went as far away as we could. Now, after we get independence, there is a push to move out west, okay? We're going to go through this quite a bit quickly, but there's a lot of opportunity for people to move west of the Appalachian Mountains because the Treaty of Paris, 1783, gave the United States claim to basically all the territory right here, all the territory up to the Mississippi River, okay, off to the east. That was all under the control of the United States, okay? Early on, there were some conflicts over who owned what, but Americans could go settle out west. This is one way that Americans paid for the American Revolution. Soldiers who served were offered bounties of land, okay? This is one way that you could pay off the debt. Later on, the United States finally pays off its national debt under a president called Andrew Jackson. A lot of that is paid off by selling public land to people who want to buy it, okay? Now, obviously, this leads to intense conflict. The American military, for what is left after the Revolution, shifts its priorities away from fighting the British to fighting Indians, okay? Something that the British had kind of predicted. The British made the Proclamation Line of 1763 because they didn't want more fights with Native Americans. But once the British are gone, settlers start flooding out west, and some even went earlier than that. But settlers start living out in the western states, and this leads to more and more conflicts with Native Americans. Okay? Now, the British retained control over Canada after the American Revolution. And there's some Americans who are pretty bitter about that, and they want Canada. And the British, even though they have recognized American independence, they are still predicting, many of them predict that eventually the American colonies are going to fall apart and they're going to come crawling back to England. Okay? You know, they'll come back and say, we're so sorry. And then Great Britain will be like, sure, tell me about it. Okay? But anyways, so Great Britain continues to do everything they can to undermine the U.S. They try to get Native Americans to do more attacks across the northern border. And there's a lot of just, harassment and skirmishes out in the West, okay? Now, another barrier to American expansion is Spain, okay? Spain has a stronghold in the Southwest, but they also own Florida. And there's some disputes over where Florida ends and America begins, okay? There is this little chunk of western Florida that it's complicated history, and we're not going to get into all of it. But there's a chunk of West Florida that declares its independence from Spain, and there's the Republic of West Florida. And anyway, it's interesting. There's some interesting history there. But basically, there's conflicts with Spain. There's conflicts with England. Okay, and the United States has more and more conflicts with Indians. Okay, if you're in the army at this time, it's very likely that you can be off fighting Indians. Okay. Now, most of the army disbanded after the war was over, but there is more and more conflict, okay? Western land claims. I'm going to bring that up on the board real quick because I want y'all to see the conflict over the land. As people move out to the West, there is conflict over who owns the West, okay? And it goes back to English colonial land claims. This is one of the complicated things about history in the United States is that there are sometimes people who have deeds of land that goes back to when the Spanish claimed stuff or the French or the English. And how do you resolve land ownership whenever one country takes over another country, etc.? Okay. In this case, all these states, they are looking at their old colonial claims when they used to be part of England, and they've got to figure out where and what is owned by what. All right, so let me stop this share. Okay, we'll pull this down. Okay. Is that backwards? It's mirrored. It's weird. Zoom is mirroring it. That's wild. That's weird. It kind of makes you sick a little bit. Ugh. So the whole time, all these videos, it's been reversed. That's weird. Okay, Anyways, even though it's kind of ugly looking, let's look at this reversed map of America, okay? So you can tell these are the 13 colonies, all right? Well, what you can see is that each one of them just kind of like stuck out to the west, okay? So like Georgia used to be long, okay? Like, you know, Mommy, I'm scared of long North Carolina. Don't worry, honey. Long North Carolina doesn't exist. Long North Carolina, okay? Long North Carolina. There was even long South Carolina. They had this little like spit that went all the way to Mississippi River. Most of the colonies claimed basically everything to the Mississippi River from their borders. Probably the most infamous was Virginia. Well, Virginia used to be a bit longer, and they even claimed Ohio. The Ohio area around this Ohio River was claimed by like everyone. Pennsylvania had Massachusetts and Virginia claimed this stuff, okay? Virginia even claimed like Wisconsin, okay? Calm down, Virginia. Calm down, Virginia. But this has to do with the fact that Virginia was one of the first colonies. And so Virginia was like the first colony, so their land grant from the king, or well, actually it was Queen Elizabeth, was very vague, okay? They were like given, and remember, these are based off of maps that were made before people had explored it, okay? So the kings and queens of England and France were sitting in their drawing rooms or in their courts, and they had this old fuzzy map of like what might have been America, and they just draw some lines on it and they say, here you go, that's yours, okay? So Virginia claimed like all of this stuff, okay? The red outline, that belonged to New York, okay? And so Massachusetts even claimed like a slice through what is today Michigan and Wisconsin, okay? Virginia all the way up in Minnesota. It's crazy. But these claims were obviously a source of conflict. Whenever England was in charge, they put the proclamation line of 1763 on it, and they said, that'll fix it. They can't go past it. But now America has won, and the states now have to squabble with themselves over who gets this stuff. Okay? So, who gets what? That is the question. All right? The landed states versus the landless states. Some states had some land that they had claimed west of the Appalachian Mountains. And some states, like Rhode Island and Connecticut, were landlocked, okay? For the smaller states, this was unacceptable. If this continues, they'll never have the opportunity to grow. They'll never have the opportunity to be competitive with other states. And the other states will just dominate against them, okay? Today, we now know the solution was to just make more states. But at the time, the idea was that the 13 colonies, that was it. They were the 13 states. That's America. They don't need no more. They're good. They made a flag with 13 stars and 13 stripes. They're good, okay? Imagine if the whole country was just like one long Georgia. So we would probably be in long Georgia. Oklahoma would be like in long North Carolina. You know, all the way off to like California. If we just like sliced up the whole country in like horizontal strips. Yeah. Okay. Don't be afraid of long North Carolina, okay? Only in your nightmares. Anyways, but I don't know if I'll get that reference. It's okay. Anyways, remind me to show you the reference. Anyways, but so when you go to your therapist and you tell them about how you're afraid of long South Carolina, your therapist can tell you, don't worry about that because we have the Northwest Ordinance, okay? The Northwest Ordinance is what fixes this problem, okay? So that's on the Northwest Territory and all this. Anyways, as more and more people move out west, the western states become more democratic. There's more population growth in the backcountry, and there's more and more people that are living out in the woods, and they're able to vote. There's expansion of people living out in the west, so they're able to acquire property, which means that since they have property, they're able to vote. But some of these people who acquire property and are able to vote are not exactly sophisticated, well-born property owners. These are country people, living out in the woods, chopping down trees, beating up bears with their bare hands, that sort of, tough Appalachian hill folk, mountain people, okay, like we've talked about before. These people, many people in the East who are more settled, wealthy, established, they say, should these people be able to rule this country? Should we let them vote, And there is some division between elites in America and the more country people, okay, during this time period, okay? We got to move on, and I want to tell you about the Northwest Territory Ordinance, okay? So, this issue of westward expansion is like one of the biggest problems in the early republic, because this is like Civil War. Do we fight over this? New York and Virginia, are we going to throw hands over Ohio? Okay, who gets Ohio? And eventually the plan is nobody gets Ohio, okay? All right, so like if you and your sibling have ever fought over something, and then your mom or dad was like, fine, none of y'all get this, okay? You got to learn to share. You don't get anything. Okay, Virginia and New York and all the other states, they didn't want to share. And also, it was really unlikely that Virginia could actually control Minnesota, okay? Or that Ohio would just let New York and Pennsylvania and all these other states slice it up, or like Connecticut or whatever, Massachusetts. So, Thomas Jefferson comes to the rescue, okay? Thomas Jefferson, he's a representative from Virginia, okay? Thomas Jefferson is from Virginia, the state that has one of the biggest land claims. And he decides, you know what, this is just going to be a problem. The 13 states don't need to grow any bigger, okay? We need to let these new territories become new states. These places are different. Ohio is different than New York. The people that live out there are different from New York. These are farmers. These are people who have gone out and settled this new territory. They have different interests than the people that live in, say, Massachusetts, whose society has been established for a few hundred years at this point. Well, what? We're looking at almost 200 years at this point. Okay, so they need a different government than the people in Ohio. Okay, they need representative government that represents their interests in a similar fashion to how America wanted representative government to represent their interests rather than England. Okay, so they choose to do something called the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Okay, what this does, okay, is it creates a huge surveys of all the land in the states that will become Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, this area of the country, everything north of the Ohio River, okay? Everything north of the Ohio River is divided up into lots, okay? And it's literally divided up into squares. They go through and they slice up the map and they make these little lots, and each lot has little lots within it, okay? And they put these surveys and they section up each little part of the states into little easily divided lots that could then be sold, okay? A single lot of, 1 square mile or 640 acres was $640, so $1 an acre. That was more expensive than some people wanted to pay, but again, this is cheaper than buying land in Europe, okay? And so each of these lots can then be sold to people who want to settle in it, okay? And we also see private companies of land speculators buying land from the U.S. government in bulk and then selling it to small farmers individually, okay? This helps pay off some of our national debt, but it also sets up orderly settlement of the West. Not just you will go out there, you find a good spot, you start chopping down trees and you say, this is mine, but rather you get permission from the government, you go to your lot, you clear your lot out, and then you settle there. You'll notice that in some of these towns, if you go up to this part, what we call the Midwest today, all the settlements, all the towns are in very orderly places. They're all like straight lines, okay? The city of Indianapolis is a really good example of this, okay? The city of Indianapolis, it's not the convoluted mess that, say, like Dallas, Texas is, okay? If you go to the city of Indianapolis, there are like 10 roads that go north and south and 10 roads that go east and west, and they're all one way, okay? So the center of the town, you go one way north, one way south, one way north, one way south, kind of like how they were doing Walmart during the, they finally got rid of those stickers, or maybe they still have them, but like you only go down this lane one way, go down the next lane. They like organized the city of Indianapolis to be so like neat and orderly. And I don't know if that is a direct result of the Northwest Ordinance or just something that's kind of coincidental, but it's like a square, it's logical, everything kind of seems to fit well, which may be a problem because, there's like nature in the way, like rivers and forests and things. But this allows for the settlement of lots and lots of little farms. And if you go out to that part of the world, you'll see all these like right angles where streets intersect and all these nice little square-shaped farms. Like if you fly over it, everything's nice little squares, okay? And that goes back, likely, to stuff like this, where some guys in Philadelphia, later on Washington, D.C., sit around, well, I think at this point they're Philadelphia, New York. They sit around, they just, okay, let's slice up this place like this, Ohio like this, and then you go settle it. What the Northwest Ordinance also did was it set up the procedure for new states to enter the Union, okay? As these territories got certain numbers of people and certain numbers of settlements, they could then go through a series of steps to join the country, okay? I believe this is set up with the Northwest Ordinance, okay? Like 95, 97% sure. Anyways, moving on. So what it does is okay. When the population reached 60,000, the inhabitants might apply for statehood, okay? The whole Northwest Territory was to be divided into not less than 3 nor more than 5 states. And so it ends up becoming the states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and then part of it ends up becoming Minnesota, okay? One thing that this did was it outlawed slavery north of the Ohio River. And you start to see a legally binding way to divide the North and the South over the question of slavery, which is something we're going to come back to later on, okay? Now, here's the thing, though. This system of creating territories that were outside the jurisdiction of the states did a few different things. Number one, it created power for the federal government. This land that did not belong to individual states belonged to the federal government. And the federal government could sell that land to pay off its debts and could set up new states there in that new territory that would balance out the 13 original states, okay? But also, it totally ignored the Indians that lived there, okay? It wasn't just a blank space on a map for you to slice up. These lines cut right through Indian territory, cut right through rivers and villages and hunting grounds, okay? These lots, this square that you go, you're a farmer, you want to move to Ohio, you go to the land office, you buy your plot of land, you go to where your plot of land is, and you say, this is mine now. Oh, wait, there's Indians living there, okay? This, again, leads to conflict. Lots and lots of people moved to the Northwest Territories. Again, the 13 colonies were getting a little crowded by the time the Revolution happened. There's a lot of people that want to move west, and they start doing it as soon as they get the chance. But again, this leads to conflicts, okay? Here's like a blurry picture of they would take, say, Ohio, they'd slice it up into little squares, and then each square would get cut up into tinier squares, okay? And they would reserve certain parts of land for like schools or for different things, and you'd have different sections of land. So it's all just like perfectly made into little grids, okay? So the territory is closed off to slavery, but it is opened up for settlement. And this question has been decided, there will be no long South Carolinas, okay? Sorry, Nathan. No long South Carolinas for you, okay? But what do we do now? We're continuing to grow, and we're united together in our fight against the British. But once our common enemy is gone, again, and even while there's a common enemy, there are still causes for division, okay? One of the divisions in America has to do with the idea of slavery, okay? In 1775, African Americans are 20% of America's population, and nearly 90% of them are in the South, Okay? This causes some philosophical and ethical quandaries for many of the founding fathers who talk about the idea of liberty. Think about Thomas Jefferson. He is the man that wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Okay? He writes this down while owning lots of people. Okay? You know, how does someone own another person and then turn around and say that all men are created equal? Perhaps this is just implying that he didn't feel that African American men were people, or perhaps he saw that he had some problems with own self. And in fact, a lot of the founding fathers write about this, like they realize, like, you know, this is kind of messed up that we own people, okay? And some founding fathers believed that the institution of slavery was going to die out over time because it was proving to be more and more unprofitable. Now, we need to talk about that whenever we talk about during the Constitution, when it's written, there is a compromise over slavery, and one of the parts of the compromise is the ending of the importation of slaves. And a lot of that was done because people thought that slavery was going to phase out. And then this dude named Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. But we can talk about that later. Okay, the cotton gin kind of changed things. But there's many people who have difficulty reconciling the ideal of Republican liberty with the idea of slavery. However, on the other side, there are some people who argue that having slaves is key to having their own liberty. Okay? There is an argument that has been made by historians that because many of these people who wrote about liberty owned slaves, they had a deeper understanding of liberty. Okay? Let me explain. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, some of the greatest founding fathers who worked very, very hard to secure liberty for the American people, all owned slaves. When they looked at the things that the King of England was doing, perhaps they were reminded of things that they were doing themselves with their own slaves. And they were realizing that, hey, this is what a master does to his slaves. The king is treating us like we treat our slaves. Okay? That's a possible theory. I don't know if it's true or not. But owning slaves makes you keenly interested in the idea of liberty and the definition of what it means to be free, because you know what it is to not be free. Does that make sense? Right? Anyways, but for some Southerners, their whole way of life depended upon their income that came from slavery in their plantations. Okay? And so their freedom to be wealthy, to have large plantations, to be successful, whatever, depended on others' bondage. Okay? However, this is mostly in the South where we see those plantation-based economies or agriculturally export-focused economies. In the northern colonies, where agriculture on a commercial scale just wasn't as feasible, like Massachusetts is not going to crank out a bunch of tobacco and sell it. Okay? In the northern colonies, where that's not as feasible, slavery is never really popular. Okay, and so there's not as many slaves, and so there's not as many people who want to have slaves. And so for many, they see that slavery is a problem, and they work to abolish slavery. If you look at the original draft of the Declaration of Independence, what Thomas Jefferson wrote as his rough draft, he was actually much, much, much more critical of slavery in his original draft than he was in the final draft, which is interesting, okay, because Thomas Jefferson kind of blames the problem of slavery on King George III in the original draft of the Declaration of Independence. When you get some time, go look at the original draft of the Declaration of Independence. You can actually see like the stuff that like Benjamin Franklin like crossed out. Benjamin Franklin was like, okay, Tommy, this sucks. We're cutting this out, okay? And you know, and Jefferson was like, what are you doing, Ben? Okay, but they probably didn't call each other that. But anyways, probably like Mr. Jefferson, Mr. Franklin, whatever. Anyways, but Thomas Jefferson, he puts this rough draft of like the Declaration of Independence forward to people, And it says all this stuff about how like slavery is bad and it's all King George's fault, which is really weird because he owned slaves. That gets removed in the final draft, but they leave in the part about all men being created equal. I had a history professor once, Dr. John Smith, who believed that that was Thomas Jefferson trying to distract the founding fathers. He was like pulling a con on them. He like put all this stuff about slavery in it. And so they all got upset about it and they got rid of the slavery. And then they didn't notice the part where he said all men are created equal. Who knows, okay? There is mixed evidence. Was Thomas Jefferson someone who had slaves but like kind of wished that slavery didn't exist? And if so, why didn't he just get rid of his slaves and let them be free? You know, or was Thomas Jefferson just kind of like oblivious and he was like, well, you know, everybody has slaves, but I'm talking about freedom for white people. The truth is that people are complicated, okay? A lot of times people today want to look back at the founding fathers and say they're all terrible because they had slaves. And in some ways, they're right, okay? Today, we consider slavery to be a moral evil, okay? And we think that people who owned slaves were wrong, okay? But you can't always judge people in the past by your beliefs today, okay? Because you've grown up in a whole different world, okay? And they grew up in a whole different world. The things that they were raised to believe, the things that they were raised to say, the society that surrounded them, all caused them to think and believe and do things much differently than you, okay? And they would likely look at the things that you do and see a lot of things that you do as wrong and morally evil, okay? Because they've been raised in a different place than you were. The truth is that people can be bad and good at the same time. Someone can do something really awesome and also do something really bad. Think about Benedict Arnold. He helped win the American Revolution, then he betrayed the American people. People have the capacity for good and bad. So, my recommendation is don't throw away someone just because they do something bad, okay? Just because these people had slaves doesn't mean that you should learn about them and learn from them and show a little bit of gratitude to them for the things that they did. Thomas Jefferson owned slaves, but the words that he wrote, that all men were created equal, helped get slaves freedom years later, okay? These founding fathers, they are flawed. They are not perfect. But if it wasn't for them, we would not be here enjoying the level of prosperity and freedom that we have today. They made a lot of mistakes, but they also did some good things, okay? So don't count them out just because you don't like everything they do. All right, with that, we'll stop for today, and then hopefully next week we can learn about the Constitution. Y'all have a great day. Do good things, be good people, make good choices. Have a good weekend. We'll see you later.